The way inflation is measured and often presented really does not tell the whole story. Popular measurements like the CPI or the PCE Index that the Fed likes to use only tell part of the story, and you're missing a lot of the underlying information that goes into it. In this video, I'm going to go over the problems with how inflation is measured and the information that's really being left out of the conversation. But before I get into that, I just want to introduce myself for anyone who's new to the channel. My name's Jack Duffley. I'm a 23-year-old real estate investor and soon-to-be attorney, and on this channel I cover a variety of topics as they relate to real estate, the markets, investing, pretty much everything as it has to do with personal finance. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to have a look around the channel, and if you like what you see, be sure to subscribe. First, we'll go over how inflation is currently measured. Now, inflation refers to the general rise in prices that occurs over time. However, it doesn't necessarily occur naturally. I'll get into that in just a second, but it's important to know what inflation is because that's going to determine how valuable certain types of debt are going to be and whether you can expect prices to go up in the future, because expectations are very important when it comes to investing or spending your money and how you're going to behave when it comes to saving and all the things that really run an economy. If you expect high inflation in the future and your money isn't in something that rises with inflation, you're going to lose the value of that currency. So if you're just holding cash and you have a lot of inflation come online, then all of a sudden your cash is worth less by the time you want to use it in the future. Similarly, if you have the opportunity to take low interest rate debt and you expect high inflation in the future, then you want to take that debt most likely since the inflation is going to eat away at the value of that debt. Now, inflation in the United States is measured using either the CPI or the PCE. The CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index, while the PCE stands for Personal Consumption Expenditures, and that's turned into an index as well. And that's the main measurement that the Fed uses, the Federal Reserve, the people that control our monetary supply. Both the CPI and the PCE Index will try to take a basket of goods that people are going to buy and services as well. So they're going to look at healthcare costs, they're going to look at food costs, and everything that someone's going to buy. Now, it is a very subjective metric since not everyone's going to spend the same exact way, but it does a decent job of giving a ballpark consideration for as to how much prices are rising compared to the previous year. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go over problems with this basket of goods itself, since there is some controversy there. Is the basket really that accurate? Are they really factoring in certain goods and services at an appropriate proportion of the basket? It's definitely up for debate. There's some studies that would suggest that the inflation rate is actually much higher than it is, and others that would suggest it's lower. It really does kind of depend on the person, but I'm going to assume that the CPI and the PCE in this video are correct, that they do accurately tell you what the rise in prices was compared to the previous year. Now, generally, what's referred to as the inflation rate is the actual CPI index or the PCE index change. It's going to see how much prices have changed compared to the last year. And if there's a rise in those prices, if there's a rise in the price of the basket, then that would be deemed inflation at whatever that rate was. Now, over the last few years, the CPI has only risen by a couple percent per year. So that is declared as low inflation. Because the CPI didn't jump up 10%, that means we didn't have a ton of inflation. We didn't have a ton of currency devaluation. Therefore, this is still a low inflation environment. We can keep printing money as much as we want without consequence. And if we just look at the CPI or the PCE and see that it's a low single-digit number and then declare that that's low inflation, it ignores a very important thing, and that's the actual productivity and what the natural course of things would have been had we not had a bunch of monetary inflation and monetary printing and all this new debt enter the system. Because the natural course of things is actually price deflation. We normally would see prices go down over the long term as productivity rises. Let me show you an actual graph of the inflation rate throughout the United States history. Now, this is based on the CPI, so I am using the CPI here to keep things consistent to kind of put it in perspective. The natural course of things is not a 0% inflation rate. Now, notice on this graph, basically every year prior to 1913, which was when the Federal Reserve was created, had deflation. Now, there were some very dramatic inflationary spikes, and these almost universally occurred during times of war. We have the Revolutionary War. We have the War of 1812, where the U.S. had its capital burned down. We had the Civil War, where many hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives and industry was destroyed across the board in many parts of the country. It makes sense during times of crisis that you'd see inflation, since you have the government often taking a ton of control over things and printing a ton of currency to pay for new debt and do all sorts of things to try and finance the war effort. It's sort of excusable in that case, since it is a big-time conflict that you don't really get a second shot at trying to fix. So you're going to look at the short term there, since in the long run, if you lose a war, it's a lot worse than facing decreasing inflation over the long term. But that's beside the point. Just notice how, besides war years and a couple other years, the vast majority of years prior to 1913 were deflationary. That means prices went down in general. Well, why is that? Isn't deflation bad? Well, it depends on what kind of deflation you're talking about. Certain types of deflation, mainly the destruction of currency, that would probably be bad because you're taking money out of supply and you're artificially lowering prices, not because of productivity, but simply because there's less money floating around. That's actually what happened later on in the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve actually removed a ton of currency from the supply, so we actually saw a really sharp deflation that was exacerbated by the Federal Reserve's actions. But the good kind of deflation is where productivity increases, and because of how humanity operates since the Industrial Revolution especially, we've had increased productivity almost every year, definitely every decade, that causes things to be cheaper to produce, or we are able to produce more things or better things to where older things become cheaper as well, and the general standard of living rises for everyone. Of course that's the case. People in the 1700s had a much worse lifestyle than we do here in the 21st century. And I know people like to be dramatic and say that 2020 was the worst year on record, and don't get me wrong, there was some serious hardship through 2020, but was it really worse than the Black Death period in the 1300s where something like a third of Europe died to one disease? Was it really worse than the years before proper plumbing and electricity and all the things that many humans well before us had to face on a daily basis? That was a tangent. I digress. Back to this chart. So you see what happens. You have productivity getting higher and higher, which causes prices to decrease, and the standard of living got much better, especially during this period after the Civil War. The 1870 to 1890 period is often called the Great Deflation, and it was coincided not with suffering and terrible economic times, but the exact opposite. America became a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse and a global powerhouse because of its strong economy and because of a lack of currency manipulation. Not that there wasn't any, but she had productivity increasing across the board and prices were decreasing because of that. And it's not as though people's lives got worse. They got much better. So many big industries were born out of that period and after that as well because of the new power that the US economy was able to grab, because it had sound economic and monetary policy, but it wasn't perfect by any means. I'm not saying that, but just look at the general trend. But look what happens after 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created and the ability for the government to take on more debt because the Federal Reserve could buy that debt a lot more easily, though there was still a gold standard here. The point is, currency devaluation became a lot easier for the government to do and the Federal Reserve to do. It's a quasi-government entity. It really is a government entity, especially at this point. But when it was created, there were some stricter guidelines associated with it. I'll get back to that in a second. But to finance the war effort, the Federal Reserve bought a ton of debt and helped finance a lot of government operations, which coincided with a deflationary crash as a result of currency being taken out of circulation. The Federal Reserve actually tried to tighten its balance sheet in the 20s and caused a short recession there, but then we had the exuberance of the rest of the 20s that caused a lot of inflation on the debt side especially, and then that caused the Great Depression, which also had some currency tightening there, which caused even more deflation than there might have already been. And then after that, there kind of was no looking back after World War II when the government financed a gigantic war effort. We won World War II, obviously very important, but after that, look what continued. You had inflation, financing larger and larger government actions, but the sort of straw that broke the monetary camel's back was in 1971 when the gold standard was removed, and therefore the Federal Reserve had essentially nothing restricting it from creating new currency. As long as it had bonds to buy, it could basically keep going forever. There wasn't any gold reserve restriction on dollars, but a lot of the restrictions that the Federal Reserve had starting in 1913 were mostly gone by 1971 anyways, so it's not as though this was huge. However, removing the gold standard did usher in a new era of very steady and constant inflation, and eventually we get to where we are today, where inflation really has become a norm every single year. Yet we call it low inflation so long as it's less than about a 3% increase on the CPI. But does that really mean that there's no inflation, that there's no real currency devaluation, and that the government can just print money without consequence? Well, maybe if you assumed that without any Fed intervention, the CPI would always be a natural 0%, which might be a natural inclination to think, but that's not the case in reality. Look at what happened before we had the Federal Reserve. The natural course of things is deflation, a reduction in prices because of an increase in productivity and human ingenuity. That's what the CPI doesn't really tell you on its own. It just says that the prices of goods increased. It doesn't tell you how much the prices of goods would have decreased had we just let things run their course. So rather than have the ability to buy things more cheaply as time goes on, the government keeps printing new money, issuing new debt to keep prices on the rise. That does help a a certain class of people, mainly the invested class and people who have fixed rate debt. They benefit from inflation at a very disproportionate rate compared to savers and generally poorer people who don't have a ton of inflation protected assets or assets that will actually appreciate with inflation. But the whole point of this video is to point out that the natural course of things is deflation, not inflation, not even 0% inflation on the CPI or the PCE. It is actually deflation. We would normally expect things to decrease in price as productivity rises, as people get better at producing things, as businesses get more efficient. That's exactly what we would expect over the long run. But instead, we get... So remember, even though someone might say that inflation is low at 2%, don't forget all of the deflation that was basically canceled out by the currency devaluation that we had. But that's pretty much all I've got for today. I did some research over this last year about the Federal Reserve and looked at that paradigm after 1913, where we went from very consistent deflation across the board to this very inflationary environment up until today, outside of a few notable exceptions, of course, but the general trend was after 1913, inflation was the theme, and before 1913, deflation was the theme. We'll see if we get any sort of shift either towards even more inflation or perhaps deflation. We'll see what happens in the future, but whatever the case, I'll be sure to cover it. But if you like this video, please like it, since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about the markets and investing and pretty much everything as it has to do with personal finance, then definitely subscribe, since I put out new videos every single week and wouldn't want you guys to miss out. And there's lots of free stuff using the affiliate links in the description below, so definitely check those out. You can get some free stocks for signing up for a couple brokerages like Robinhood and Webull, and M1 Finance still has their promotion going on for the rest of January, so check that out. But until next time, take care.